Hello and welcome to your mod spotlight on RemoteTech by Pepe23. This mod changes how probes work in Kerbal Space Program, so instead of just being a weaker reaction wheel to something that's manned, now they have their own mechanic that requires them to have a signal back to the Kerbal Space Center in order to be able to operate. So let's hop in the VAB and take a look at that. First off, RemoteTech doesn't change anything about any of the manned command modules. It only changes stuff with the probes. It adds a couple of different modules that first allows them to be controlled by RemoteTech, and second allows you to have an antenna on board each of the probes. So if we grab just one of the standard probes and we look over at the modules attached to it, you'll see Signal Processor, which is remote control capable, and Technology Perk, which is an integrated omnidirectional antenna that's good for 3 kilometers, and that's always on, so you can't disable this. So what do these two things mean? Well, Signal Processor means that RemoteTech has taken control of the probe. Now, Technology Perk is just an integrated omnidirectional antenna, and that's important because it allows you to control your probe on the launch pad without having to actually open up, say, a full antenna. So if you look down in the Science tab, you will notice there are a few new dishes and a few new antennas, as well as RemoteTech changing how the old antennas worked. So now the Communitron 16 is one of the RemoteTech antennas. So you can see its omnidirectional range is 2.5 million meters, it uses some energy, and it snaps under high dynamic pressure. Snapping under high dynamic pressure is good to know because if you try to set this thing on the side and talk to different probes with it, then you can break it during launches or re-entries, or even if you're trying to aerobrake on something like Duna or Eve, you will destroy the antenna, which can completely limit your communications, since if you don't have an antenna to talk to your network, then you won't be able to control your probes. Now, of course, the omnidirectional antennas work a little differently than the dish antennas. So you can see here's one of the dish antennas, ComTech 1. It has a much larger range. Instead of only being 2.5 million meters, it's got 350 gigameters. Of course, it uses more electric charge per second, and it has something called a cone angle of 0.01 degrees. Basically, the dish antennas have to be pointed at a target, so you can target any celestial body or any craft, and it will face the target, and anything within 0.01 degrees of that target this dish is going to be able to talk to, meaning the further away you have more area coverage, but the closer you have much less area coverage. Of course, we'll be seeing both of these in action in a little bit, but there is a difference between them, so we're just going to start with omnidirectional antennas for now. The largest omnidirectional antenna you can actually get is going to be the Communitron 32, and it sits at 5 million meters, which is about halfway to the moon. So the omnidirectional antennas will not allow you to communicate from Kerbin to the moon, only about halfway. Since the moon sits at about 11 million meters from Kerbin, and just for reference, Kerbin's sphere of influence is approximately 80 million meters. Meaning if you look at this one, the Reflectotron KR7, its max range is 90 million meters. This will allow you to talk to anything in Kerbin's sphere of influence rather easily with a cone angle of 25 degrees, so it has pretty good coverage. Of course, we'll be seeing these in use in a little bit. In flight, a couple things have changed as well. The first thing you'll notice is at the top left, you will see this D plus a very fine point seconds, and then this green button here. Now the D means delay, so currently while we're sitting right next to the Kerbal Space Center, there is no delay, but the further away you get, delay will happen since communications between all of your satellites and probes can only happen at the speed of light. When you start traveling to places like Duna, you're going to start getting between a minute to 2 minutes of delay, and if you try and do a fine-tuned landing on Duna, having a 1 minute delay makes it quite difficult from when you can react to something to when you actually see it occur. For that, you actually have the flight computer, although we're going to be getting to the flight computer later when we actually take on a mission and start dealing with delay. So we'll talk about the flight computer later. Now, let's get back to the probe. If you right-click on your probe, you'll notice a couple different things. You'll see SPU is operational, that means it's basically working. Omni range, which is 3 kilometers, so this has an antenna for 3 kilometers, and as long as it has electric charge, that will be operational. So it'll say idle. If it says disabled, that means it's not working and you can't talk to it. So because this is green up here, it means we are in communications range. So how about we try and launch this thing? and because there's no delay, it works just like a normal probe. Let's go to half throttle and take off with this. Now, as long as you're in communications range and you're close to your Kerbal Space Center, usually about the sphere of influence of Kerbin, you won't have delay that's noticeable. So let's accelerate some more until we get too far away from the Kerbal Space Center, and we'll see exactly what happens to this probe. Now that we're over 2 kilometers, we should be seeing it happen very soon. And you'll notice this turned red, and our engine actually shut off. We have no control over this vessel right now, no connection. Since the omnidirectional antenna in the probe is 3 kilometers, now that we've gone 3 kilometers away from the Kerbal Space Center, we've lost connection, which means we cannot communicate to this probe anymore. So it's acting as if this probe just ran out of electric charge, even though it has plenty of it, because we can't communicate to it. So no matter what we do, we can't control it, we can't actually change anything in it. If we want to, we can't change the engine, we can't say shut down, can't say turn on no connection to send the command on, because this probe is not connected to our network. Now, when it falls down below the 3 kilometer range, we will actually regain connection to it. Let's actually see that happen, because once it gets back in range, we will regain our communications. And there we go, communications are back, and it'll go back to its original setting where it was firing full throttle. So even if your probes run out of range, you can reconnect them as long as you put them back in range to reconnect. So if we can't launch a probe without needing some antenna, what antenna is actually good? Well, if you remember snaps under high dynamic pressure, this basically means unless you're sitting it inside of a fairing, it's not going to work, and even if you do extend it to use it, it probably won't work because these antennas start retracted, which means they're not activated, and if you lose communications, you can't tell the probe to activate the antenna. So that's something to keep in mind. Now, RemoteTech actually adds an antenna that's really good for launching, and it's this one, the Reflectitron DP10. It's got 500 kilometer range, meaning it's good for getting into orbit easily. It's good for much more than that. It's activated by default, and it does not snap under high dynamic pressure, meaning you can set one of those on the side of your vessel, and your vessel will be able to communicate with the Kerbal Space Center until it gets into orbit and goes on the dark side of the planet, since you do need line of sight for all of your antennas to work. Both omnidirectional and dish antennas require line of sight, so planets will block communications. Now if you look, we're currently sitting at 5 kilometers up above the surface, and we are still in communications range because of the Reflectitron. Because this thing has a larger range, we are able to keep in communication with it. Now, a problem with this is if we actually deactivate this, we will lose communications, in which we will not be able to reactivate it. If it were to break off, we would lose communications, and then we wouldn't be able to do anything about it. Or for some reason, if it was destroyed, if we ran out of power, many conditions, anything that would shut this down from being able to talk with this vessel to the network would cause us to lose communications with our probe, which ultimately would make it so that we can no longer use the probe since it would act as though it has no power, since it has no communication. So let's actually open up the map view because there's something different about this as well. As well as in flight, where you have this new button over here, in the map view you actually have this nice line drawing system that tells you where everything is talking. So as you can see, my small probe is talking to a node. The red means that that's somewhere that I can receive communications from. And you can create more areas to receive communications from by creating portable bases that allow you to talk to your probes, so you can work around the delay, and I'll show one of those in action in a little bit. But as you can see, we can tell that we are talking to the Kerbal Space Center with this nice green line. Now the line will disappear if we lose communications from it for whatever reason, and we will also be able to see it talking to other probes that are connected, and we'll actually look at a full setup network in a bit. But what just happened when we hit the atmosphere? Well, we have no connection, so we're not connected to the Kerbal Space Center. The planet is actually, if you look at the horizon, the red dot is below the horizon, meaning the planet is blocking our signal to the Kerbal Space Center. So if we were trying to land anywhere that's not in direct communications of the Kerbal Space Center, then we actually wouldn't be able to activate our parachutes at this point. So even if we had parachutes on this probe, they wouldn't be able to be activated because we have no connection. so this probe would be destined to crash. However, because it was falling so fast, it overheated and exploded anyway. Let's take a look at some of the other stuff RemoteTech has. Now, what we're looking at here is two probes that are talking to each other. So as you can see, I have my small probe and my small probe 2. Both of them are the same design, just labeled accordingly so that they're easier to tell apart. They're in a very similar orbit, and as you can see, there is this gray line that's connecting the two of them together. However, neither of them have any connection, because neither are connected to the command center. Let's time accelerate a little bit until this probe gets connected, and see what happens. Now, once our small probe 2 connects to the command center, this probe gets its own signal, and then it's able to relay the signal down to the other probe. So if we switch to this one over here, it will also ultimately have connection. Its delay will be increased, but it is connected because it's being connected through this probe. And it'll highlight in a green line which path you're taking. So if you have multiple connections all over, it will try and find the shorter path to get to a command center so the delay is minimized, if of course you have multiple connections. So it has a green line to the small probe 2, and then that has a line down to the command center. And you can see this change that it will try and find the shortest route. When we actually go around the planet a little bit, you'll notice now the shortest route is directly to the Kerbal Space Center. It still has this secondary route of being able to talk to the probe over there in case that probe loses communications or something goes on, but now the quickest route is just directly down to the Space Center since now it's in visible range. So you can see the route the signal is taking, as well as all of the possible connections that are available. Now, these connections are happening automatically because both of these probes are using omnidirectional antennas, which is this one that we talked about earlier. Now, omnidirectional antennas will do this. They will be able to communicate to everything within their range. So anything within 500 kilometers of this probe can talk to without needing to do anything. Dish antennas work a little bit differently, so let's bring one of those up into space. Now, this probe we have here is using a couple of the KR7s. Now, unlike the omnidirectional antennas that just have to be activated, whereas this one starts activated, but normally they start deactivated and you just have to right-click them and say activate, the dish antennas need to be given a few more instructions. First, they need to be told that they can be activated. So now once we click activate, it tells us its range, which is 90 million meters, its energy use, if it's operational or not, and then it tells us a target. So it has no target. Well, when we click on this option, we get this antenna configuration. So what should its target be? Well, currently we only have vessels around Kerbal. So we can either tell it it's going to target Kerbal itself, or we can tell it to target Mission Control, any of the two small probes we have, or even if we want to tell it to target the moon, we can. We can tell it to target anything that we want. Now, on the right side of this window, you'll notice that you can see the current distance from things. Let's mouse over Kerbal. Current distance is 1.05 million meters. The antenna range is 90 million meters. That means we can cover this area. Nothing is red, meaning we can see it. If we mouse over Eve, you'll notice the current distance is 4.79 gigameters, and the antenna range is only 90 million meters, so the target is not in range. That's not something we can point at. Now, when we mouse over Kerbal again, you'll see that the Info tab, it says 454.52 kilometer beam covers 0 targets. That would tell you how many targets you're going to cover if you point it at something. So if you point it at a planet, then generically you will be able to see how many different targets you can cover because the dish antenna works in the cone. If anything enters that cone, then you will be able to talk to it. Let's point one of these at Kerbal just for the time being to see how it works, and open up our map view. Now we can close out of this if we want, and you can see we have a green line talking to the Kerbal Space Center. What that green line actually is it's our omnidirectional antenna. Let's disable that for now. Now we're running solely off the reflectotron. And let's take a look. You will notice these two beams. You can disable it if you don't want to see it, but we're going to keep it enabled because it's easier to tell where it's pointing. It's pointing at Kerbal, so it's always going to point at the center of Kerbal. And the cone angle is 25 degrees, so it's these two lines, anything inside of those two lines we can talk to. The Kerbal Space Center is currently in between those two lines, so we can communicate to it. Let's see what happens when this probe moves a little bit more forward so that we can start talking to it as well. Now you will notice we are able to talk directly to the Kerbal Space Center, and we also have an alternative route to talk to the probe if we so choose. So you can see we have an orange line connecting us to the probe. Now if we look at the very bottom right of the map view, you'll notice this green satellite button. This will actually open up all of your reflectotrons, or all of your dishes, I should say. So you can see we can actually left click on it, and then we can get our target list. So previously we're targeting Kerbin, now we can say specifically target mission control. So now instead of just pointing at Kerbin, we will specifically point at mission control. And even if we actually tell it to target Kerbin, you'll notice how those two probes are behind Kerbin, but they're still actually within the cone angle. You'll see when I mouse over, it says the beam now covers 2 targets instead of only 1. I'm going to leave this one pointing at mission control, and we're actually going to set the other one. And the other one is currently not pointed at anything. So how about we tell it to point at the second small probe. But now that this one's been given a target, all we have to do is say activate. And now that it is active, it will point at its own target. So let's time accelerate and see how these things work. The dish antennas will always point at the target they're given. So if they, for some reason, lose vision, so you'll see in a second when Kerbin rotates too much, we will lose communications. They will automatically try and retarget once they regain their ability to communicate. So we probably also ran out of electric charge, but now that we have more charge, you'll see they're trying to communicate again. So once we touch the Kerbal Space Center, you'll get a better idea on how dishes work. Here we go. Now that we are talking to everything, you will see that the dish is talking to the Kerbal Space Center, the command center down on the ground. The second dish is pointed at the small probe, and those two are communicating. However, even though this probe down here, the first small probe, is within communications range, it's in between the two lines, those two can't communicate. And I'll talk about why that is. This is a mechanic of RemoteTech. So you'll see we are able to talk with this one, and it's of course connecting to our satellite, our dish network. However, even though the first small probe, the one that's further away, is within the cone angle, it can't talk to it. So let's deactivate this one to show it. Now this one's deactivated, and as you'll notice, this one, even though it's within the cone angle and its antenna's up, it can't talk to our dish probe. So why is that? Well, in order for communications to happen, you need to have both send and receive. Both are required. So this one only has an omnidirectional range of 500 kilometers. Because it only has an omnidirectional range of 500 kilometers, if we set this as a target and we see the distance is 780 kilometers, this one's own antenna cannot communicate to that one over there until we get closer. So you'll see in a moment we will actually gain connection to it. There we go. Now that we're actually within a reasonable distance, the 500 kilometers, we are able to now communicate with it, whereas previously we couldn't, because both communicating parties need to be able to reach each other. Meaning, if you're going to communicate way out of planet, say if you want to communicate to something over at Ike or Duna, what's going to be required is you need something with a long-range probe in Kerbin's sphere of influence, and then you need something with a long-range satellite over in Duna's sphere of influence, so the two long-range satellites can communicate back and forth to one another. If you put a long-range satellite in Duna and point it at Kerbin, nothing in Kerbin will be able to talk to it unless something in Kerbin has a long-range satellite of equal or greater distance to the one at Duna. Basically, both sets need to communicate. So all comm satellites, all of the dish satellites, they need to have two parts. One that's sending it from the location you want to do your operations, and then one usually at Kerbin to receive it so that it can send it back to the Kerbal Space Center where the signal can actually get processed, and then you are actually able to start giving orders out.
So all satellites need to be 2 parts. Same thing with the omnidirectional antennas. If you have one omnidirectional antenna that's good for 500 kilometers, and then you have another one that's good for 2.5 kilometers, the maxed range you can actually pull off is 500 kilometers. I've gone ahead and loaded up a save that has many more probes with this communication network kind of set up. So let's take a look at what mad science we have here. Now, I'm going to activate all of the filters so that we can see all the communications, and you will notice there's quite a bit going on. First off, there are these 3 probes here. Each of them are just going to be labeled test rocket, but what they do is they form a triangle. Now this triangle is actually the core of the network that I have set up for this particular saved world. Now what this means is at least one of these test rockets at any given time are able to talk to the red dot, the Kerbal Space Center. So if we time accelerate a little while, you'll notice at any given time one of them are always talking to the Kerbal Space Center. This means that I always have communications back to Kerbin. At any given time, I will always have communications. And then these 3 rockets, each of them, at least one of the triangle ends, are able to talk to these inner or outer probes at any given time. So you can see this outer probe right here is being talked to. At least one of these triangle pieces are always communicating to it. So if we keep spinning, you'll see, once this triangle loses its distance, about at this time, you'll notice that the next triangle piece, just a second delay, will start communicating to it. So there are very few blackout windows for this one. Same with the other probe on the inside. It's always able to communicate to at least one of the triangle endpoints. And since the triangle is always able to communicate with the Kerbal Space Program, or the Kerbal Space Center, that means the inside probe is always able to communicate to the outside world. Now the inside probe, having pretty much 100% communications, can talk to anything over out at the moon if the moon's antennas were activated. However, they have been deactivated for whatever reason, probably due to lack of electric charge. Now what this triangle allows is so that I can have communication with Kerbin at any given time. So anything in Kerbin's sphere of influence, I'm able to communicate to all the time. I don't have to worry about my satellites going on the dark side of Kerbin and losing communication, because I have a triangle that actually allows you to set this up. So it's a good idea to try and set up a triangle like this so you always are able to talk to the Kerbal Space Center, and then inside that triangle make sure you have other probes that are able to then talk to your triangle using, of course, omnidirectional satellites and dish satellites, so that you have constant communication with your entire network. So you can see this probe right here. This one has a dish satellite that's pointed at the moon, so we can communicate there. And it's got another one that's pointed at nothing. But then the omnidirectional satellite on the side here is what's giving it its communication to all of the other probes. And if we go to one of the triangle endpoints, let's switch to that, then the triangle ends actually communicate to each other. So you'll notice we have this one, which is pointed at the other triangle end, and then we have another one that's pointed at yet again another triangle end. So we have 2 antennas that we pointed at the other 2 triangle pieces. Let's actually enable that view right now. So it's kind of hard to see with all the other lines, but one of these dish antennas, you can see by the cone, is pointed at that triangle endpoint, and the other dish antenna by this cone is pointed at the other triangle endpoint. And then the omnidirectional satellite is what's giving it communications to the Kerbal Space Center. Now, just because we're using an omnidirectional satellite for this setup doesn't mean we couldn't use another dish to point it at the Kerbal Space Center and then actually allow us to communicate to it. Omnidirectional or dish satellites work as well, but this is the setup we have for this, like I said. Let's take a look at that test rocket that's on the very outer rim of our orbit around Kerbin, the very outside rocket. Like I said, it has pretty much 24/7 communications with the triangle, which means it's always able to talk to Kerbin, sometimes with a little more delay than other times, but it's not significant based on where this one is pointing. So if we actually activate our cone, you will notice this line that goes straight out to Duna. That line is a satellite, it's one of the dish antennas. It's this one, a high-powered one, the Comtech 1. This has 350 gigameter range, and it's pointed directly at Duna. So if we actually zoom out a little bit, and then try and zoom in towards Duna more, we can probably just set our focus. Then you will notice, once we zoom in some, you can see that that satellite, which has a 0.01 cone angle, is actually covering all of Duna right now. So you can see based on these two lines that it's covering our entire Duna mission. Of course, we could set up another one pointed at Ike if we wanted to go to Ike, or we could redirect this one to point at Ike. Hopefully at this point you understand how omnidirectional satellites and the dish satellites work. So you can see what we have here at Duna is we have a communication line. So over here where Valentina and Magala Kerbin are, they're sitting over by a vessel that's talking back to Kerbin. Of course using all of the communications we know of. And then we're using this probe with a dish antenna to talk back to that relay. So basically we're relaying a signal all the way over here to Duna. Now, let's take a look at this. Look at our delay, 47.6 seconds for actually not that much distance. So if you actually look relative to the solar system, we're pretty close to Kerbin right now, and our delay is at 47 seconds. That is pretty intense. Why are we spinning uncontrollably? So what does this massive signal delay actually mean? Well, if for whatever reason we have our antenna, it's pointing at the Duna thing, so it actually has communications back, which means we don't need this omnidirectional antenna to be active. So once we actually are able to right click on it, because we have some phantom forces spinning this thing, let's deactivate it. Okay, so nothing happened. Well, we told it to deactivate. What does that mean? Well, in 47.6 seconds it will deactivate. Let's time accelerate until that happens. So you can see, flight computer throttling back from time warp, and we deactivated our antenna because, well, we actually had to wait that long to do it. Now, if I'm trying to use the WASD keys to control this thing, they don't work. If I try to toggle SAS on and off, RCS on and off, none of these buttons happen even though I'm pushing them because we have to wait 47 seconds for anything to happen. Let's wait some more time. You'll notice we start to move a little. We had a couple toggles just show up for a second. So yeah, we have to wait 47 seconds before we can do anything. That's pretty difficult to do landings with. So a landing at this point is pretty much out of the question. But what happens if we actually go on the dark side of Kerbin? If we lose this communication line, what might we be able to do? Well, that's when the flight computer actually starts to help you, because the flight computer can kind of control this thing even with all of this delay. Push the little green button to actually open it up. If you're in communications, it'll be green. If you're not, it'll be red, and which means you can't actually control it. If you have Kerbals on board the vessel, it'll be yellow, which means local control, which means there is no delay. So what does the flight computer do? Well, each of these buttons just point you in the particular direction, and you even get a nice little tooltip. So kill rotation. Now in 47 seconds that command will go through, and we will actually be able to kill our rotation. So let's time accelerate again. There we go. Now the flight computer is being told to kill rotation. So we're done spinning around wildly. If we want to, we can say orbital mode in prograde, which is grade plus. So you can see even if you mouse over it, it says orient to prograde. You could also do surface and do the same thing for the surface mode, just based on how the navball views. So if we're at orbital prograde, then we will move down to that node there on the navball. So we'll give it a second, and there we go. We just turned to face orbital prograde. If we wanted to face normal, then we can. Of course, we just have to wait for the command to actually go through. And you can see, now we're going to face normal, which is the pole, basically. If you're heading east around Duna, it's the pole's North Pole. If you're heading west around Duna, then it's going to be the South Pole. So you can see, as long as you understand your navball, this thing is easy to control. You can also say point towards your next maneuver node. We don't actually have one, so how about we just make one and say, we're going to increase our velocity by a little bit, by about 6.1 meters per second. So now that we have a maneuver node, if we just say face towards the node, and of course we give it its little bit of time to actually maneuver us, and you will see we will now point towards the maneuver node. What else can you do? If you know how to use the nav ball, then you know how to use this at this point. Basically, all of this top stuff is all you need to know. Now, if you want to do custom, if you understand pitch, heading, and roll, you can hit custom, and then you can specify your pitch, your heading, whatever you want, roll even. You can mouse over these, select what you want them to be. So you can customize a direction you want to face. That's perfectly fine. Or you can just tell it to face one of the other ones. You can also tell it to face target if you want. Relative velocity, anything you need. Flight Computer will be able to handle that as long as you can live with the delay. Now, one way to make Flight Computer much easier to use is pushing this double arrow down here, because this will tell you everything that's queued up in your Flight Computer. So you can see we can time accelerate, we can see when the next thing is going to happen, where we were just going to face a random direction, now we're going to kill rotation, and that's the mode we're currently in. We can also say orbital prograde, and that will change the mode that we're currently in. This little menu over here gives you an idea on what's going to happen. So look, if we go to orbit, prograde, hold orbital prograde, and that's going to occur in about 45 seconds. Just like before, except now we have a timer. Now, this timer can be used to your advantage. So, let's actually remove this maneuver node for a moment and see where the timer can be used to our advantage. Now, the timer operates under a couple of rules. The first thing is that the minimum amount of time, the minimum amount of delay you can put on it is actually your base delay. So in this case, it'd be about 47 seconds. Now, if you make a number greater than that, say if we had set the timer to 2 minutes and 15 seconds, the full delay would become 2 minutes and 15 seconds, meaning it's only going to add about a minute to the timer, a minute and a half to the timer. So past the delay, there's still a minute and a half added. So basically, when you're setting a delay that's higher than your average, say 31 minutes and 15 seconds, then the full delay becomes that 31 minutes and 15 seconds. It's not 31 minutes plus, or 31 minutes 15 seconds plus your delay. That's the total delay. So it allows you to time it without actually having to do the small math of adding the two together. Now, the timer allows you to set up things like, say, in 32 minutes when we're on the dark side of the planet and we lose communications, we can actually set up a maneuver node or set up some function like disable your solar panels, enable an antenna. We can set up whatever we need when we're outside of the communication range. And as long as we told the flight computer that it needs to be done before we lose signal, so we can actually talk to the flight computer, then the flight computer will enact it. However, if we tell the flight computer to do something, and then we want to try and tell it, no, wait, we don't want that to happen anyway, you just push the little X at the top right of each of these command boxes to delete them. The problem with this is if you tell the flight computer to do something, and then you lose communications, you cannot cancel that order. And if you tell the flight computer to do something in, say, a minute, and then you try and cancel it 30 seconds later, and the delay is still at 45 seconds, then you're 15 seconds late on telling it to stop something it's going to do, which means you can't actually cancel orders unless you have sufficient amount of time. That's a benefit to using the timer. If you set things up to be much higher than the signal delay, that gives you a chance to actually cancel the order if you need to cancel it, like something were to arise. Now, the last couple of features for the flight computer that you will find very useful, probably the most useful one, will be able to burn nodes even without. So you can see this node is 3 minutes away. It'd be pretty hard to time when we can burn that using just the flight computer. So what we can actually say is execute the next maneuver node. So it will say in, 3 minutes 15 seconds, which is where the maneuver node is, it's going to execute the maneuver node. Now, this won't do it perfectly. It won't do it the way that normally we do it when we execute maneuver nodes, where we take half before and then half after. What this will actually do is it will, once the maneuver node hits, meaning once you're at the exact time, it will start burning the maneuver node. It doesn't do half before or half after. If you want to do something like that, you actually have to try and use the burn method. Now, the burn method is more of a manual throttle control. So what you can do is you can set your delay. Let's say we put up 3 minutes for this. And what you can do is you slide the throttle control, and we're going to throttle at about 52%, and then you put in how long you want to do it. We're going to say 2 seconds, and then you just click burn, and it queues up a command to burn at the specified throttle, or 52%, for the specified amount of time. So you can use this for nodes. So you will see, there we go. Time warping out, and we burned 50% for 2 seconds, just like that. So you can tell it at the maneuver node, burn a couple seconds before the maneuver node at full throttle, and then it will burn the full duration, or the duration that you've figured out, and that way you can get a more even burn, or much easier, you can just hit execute and deal with it, or use smaller maneuver nodes so that when you execute a maneuver, it doesn't matter if you burn half before or half after, that you will still end up close enough to your desired new position. So you can use the flight computer to help you with maneuver nodes, to help you with burning when you need to, facing any direction you need to. So the flight computer is one of the better ways to counter all of this signal delay. Now, other methods aside from just the flight computer to countering signal delay are other mods, for example. Like if you were to use Kerbal operating system, then you can just tell your probe to have certain conditions when things happen. And as long as you were in communications range when you wrote it, then you were able to apply it. So say if your probe gets, below 50,000 kilometers or below 50 kilometers on Duna, then initiate some landing procedure. Like you throttle, you face downward, you throttle, and you use parachutes. So you can try and program a way that probes will do it automatically where they don't need communication, because Kerbal operating system will operate without communications, as long as you were able to talk to the probe beforehand about doing what you needed to do. Say, run the program. But aside from other mods to help with signal delay, RemoteTech actually adds its own method of dealing with signal delay. And what that is this thing over here. So let's switch over to the Duna thing and see if we can't pick up one of these Kerbals that we pulled out earlier. Now, the way that RemoteTech tries to deal with signal delay is using two different parts, basically. Part 1 is this, the RCL01 Remote Guidance Unit. This thing is capable of being used as a remote base. So you have to have one of these attached to your vessel, and the second requirement is having at least 6 Kerbals. When you have at least 6 Kerbals and this remote guidance unit, the 2.5 meter probe part, then basically the craft on its own becomes a remote base. You will notice it gets this red bubble around it, and it acts just like the Kerbal Space Center, meaning we have communications even if we don't have a line back to the Kerbal Space Center. Basically what this means is that we can control these 2 probes. So let's actually head over to the one we were just using. We'll switch to it. And you will notice something about it. What's up with the delay? It's now 0.0039. That's hardly anything. That means we can now use WASD to control this thing again. If we want, we can toggle SAS on and off pretty easily. We can toggle the brakes easily. We have control of this thing again. Actually, I think I'm fighting with the flight computer. Yes, I am. I am fighting with it. Because we still actually have our delay set from the flight computer, so we're operating on a 3-minute delay. Let's remove that and cancel all of these orders. Since we have communications that are nearly instant, we can do that really fast. So now, you'll see that we took away our delay. We can toggle SAS, we can toggle RCS, we can toggle our brakes, our gear, lights, anything we want. We have control of this vessel again. We can throttle up and down normally, because our delay is low enough that we actually can control this thing again, because we're using a mobile base. Since this is connecting directly to the mobile base, which is only not that far away. If we actually set it as our target and mouse over, we can see it's only 1.1 million meters away. That's not very far. That's not a lot of signal delay. Now, because we're connected to it, we could probably land easily on Duna, since our delay is so low. Now, because this ship makes it so we have such low signal delay, we don't actually have to have this thing talking back to Kerbin. Let's deactivate that satellite that was talking all the way back to Kerbin. Now you'll notice there's no communications line back to Kerbin. This is solely operating on its own, and these 2 probes are still connected with their very minimal signal delay. The only thing that this does right now is we cannot send science back. So if we took a crew report, say right here, if we took one and we tried to send it, we can't actually send it. No comms devices on the vessel can't transmit data. But if we reactivate the ComTech, which is our big satellite, and we try to do the same thing, say review report, and send it, then it will be able to actually send the science. So when you're using a mobile outpost, such as the one I have here, it operates so you can use probes with very minimal delay, but you can't send science back unless you still have a communications line back to Kerbal. That's the only downside about using these. So if you use one and you don't have the communication line, you can't process or send data back, but you're still, you can process it in a science lab, but you can't send data back. So the mobile processing lab can't send its science, you can't send crew reports or mystery goo experiments, but you are able to operate on a much more efficient level by significantly reducing your delay. And like I said, this doesn't need to talk back to Kerbal for it to work. The only reason that we would need this thing to talk back to Kerbal at this point is to send science back. So this operates to control all of the other probes. Now, any probe can connect to this. Like I said, this probe is only required to be on the hub with the 6 Kerbals. The 6 Kerbals basically operate the part on this, the remote guidance unit, to tell this thing that it's allowed to talk to probes and be used as a mobile base. So only this probe core works with the 6 Kerbals, and any probe core can talk to the 6 Kerbals. So this vessel on its own, with the RCL01 remote guidance unit and the 6 Kerbals, is able to talk to any other probe that's within range of communication. So you still need to have communication range. Now, because we're here, might as well say this as a last thing. Local control. We can still use the flight computer if we want, but there's no point because local control means there's 0 delay. So the last way, I guess, of dealing with delay is just using Kerbals, because Kerbals will give you local control, which will operate normally as if RemoteTech 2 was not installed. However, like with how this works, if you want to send science back, even with a Kerbal in the vessel, you still need a communications line back to the Kerbal Space Center to send science back. So, although you can operate it with local control with a Kerbal, you can't send science back to the Kerbal Space Center. You can still do the experiments, you can still process it in a lab, you just can't send it unless you have that communication network. But this brings us to the end of our mod spotlight. Hopefully you guys get an understanding on how omnidirectional antennas work, satellites work, or the dish antennas work, where you have to point them at various objects to get the communications, how exactly communication networks work as well, and everything else that kind of is the base mechanics of this mod. Now, I tried to give a quick overview, and quick is definitely a relative term because this is one of the much more complicated mods that Kerbal Space Program has out there, but it's a lot of fun once you get the idea on how to use it. So, not from just what I've said, but I do recommend you go and check out the guide that is posted on Pepe's forum page where you can download the mod. Of course, there'll be a link in the description to all of that stuff, so you can get more references on what you're supposed to do with this mod, as well as try out the mod yourself. Because once you've played with it a little bit, kind of getting the basic idea on how the mod works, you will probably be able to easily figure it out from what I've said. Since, to a completely new person to Kerbal Space Program, probably this entire video didn't make much sense. But once you've actually tried out RemoteTech 2, and you're pretty good at Kerbal Space Program, probably more veteran players will like this mod rather than new players, you'll kind of get the idea. Anyhow, thank you all for watching again. This is PTT GRW, signing out.